You know, games like GreedFall are a good window to gaze through. They can serve as a reminder of how things used to be done, but also of how some of the old ways can still be viable when things are properly put into place. What do I mean by this very vague opening statement? Let's take a look. GreedFall is an action RPG set into an alternative 17th century France ravaged by war and plagues, a perfect setup to bring you joy. The player's character is a prince or princess that is sent away to a colony on a mysterious island in order to discover a cure for the disease called Malicore. As you can see, the premise isn't something out of the ordinary, but it works. It's this premise that drew me in to try this out. What can I say? I'm one big sucker for old art and architectural styles in video games, particularly one as French Baroque, which you almost never see. The art direction of the game makes it a pleasure to look at, both outside in the streets when looking at buildings and on the inside when you can admire the paintings that adorn the walls. Okay, I'll be fair. The variety of the paintings is very limited and reusing assets is a common theme throughout the game. But what's pretty remains so despite of that. There's certainly plenty of AAA titles that don't boast with in-game art as nicely done as this. But because I don't intend to spoil the story, all I can say about it is that it's decent, but not something to write home about either. If you're looking for something original, this is not the game, and the same goes for the character depth. That being said, the writing excels at world building, and for me this was good enough of a hook to keep me engaged throughout the entire playthrough. To explain why, let's take a quick look at the game's factions. First, there's the merchant congregation, the nation of your character which he serves as a legate. It's got its fair share of intrigues and plotting of the noble houses, but they are far away from the island in which you ply your trade. The next two nations which are stuck into a violent war back home are Déja and the Bridge Alliance, and they have tremendous ideological differences. The first nation is something close to a theocracy and has a radical inquisitorial order that does everything in its power to enforce the teachings of the founding prophet of the country, mainly by oppressing the subjects who dare even think of questioning them. Think of them as what your average French Republican thinks about the Catholic Church. The Bridge Alliance, on the other hand, is what happens when science does indeed go too far and is willing to pit heads against anyone who would deny the wonders of scientific progress at all costs. While the first faction made me think, man, this is such a French way of looking at things, the latter is so far away that it circles right back at being just as French. Ah, dear lord, this subtle parallel to the French Revolution won't make any sense for people from the Anglosphere. The Inquisition from Déja and the Scholars Guild of the Alliance also have their own place to part within the game's story. There are also two more important factions. First is the Nauts, a secretive seafaring guild that rules the seas and has basically a monopoly on all naval trade and to whom all nations must pay for the service. And last but not least, there's the Coin Guard, a mercenary guild that's responsible for providing protection inside cities and royal palaces. They all have to handle the situation of the native tribes of Tier 4D, the wondrous island where anything seems possible, even more so when the connection of the natives to nature proves to be deeper and more magical than what it's left to be believed initially. While the merchant congregation is neutral and tries to get along with everyone, the other two nations both try to subdue the natives in their own way. Déja tries to convert them by all means, while the Alliance wants to kill them and eradicate their cultures. GreedFall really doesn't mince its words when it comes to this conflict, just a warning for those fainter of heart out there. There are very obvious parallels to the real world history which are made respectfully. The game isn't preaching the player, it just shows the awfulness of it all. The player is set to perform quests all over the island in order to help the various factions in their conflicts. After hearing this, you might think I'm talking about a dynamic system that reacts to the action of the player, but it's nothing of the sort. Beyond the main quest, each faction has its own quest line, and completing it doesn't change how things go with other factions beyond making other quests harder to complete if they don't like you too much. It's certainly a simple system that works as intended, but it's not overly exciting either. They serve serve as the main way the player gets to see each faction and see their motivations, which plays into the game's main strengths that I mentioned before. The same goes for other quests concerning your companions. They certainly feel a little more personal since these are characters which you interact with very often, and they do a good job of fleshing them and the other factions of the game. One of them is, to me personally, one of the best quest lines of the entire game, so it's safe to say on average I enjoy these more. As many kind words I have about the world building aspect of the quests, I can't say the same thing about their design. They're not collect 20 bare asses kind of fetch quests, but they're not very far off either. Most of the time you're sent to talk to someone who then sends you to talk to someone else, followed by fighting and or collecting an item, or any variation of these. All quests tend to fall into this repetitive cycle of sending you all over the place as an errand boy for a bunch of people despite the fact that you're a legate. What makes them worse is that sometimes the ridiculous amount of backtracking you're forced to perform, making them seem even more like time wasters than anything else. It's ironic that in some cases the quests include time-saving features such as waiting for the correct time of the day or having the option to fast travel to the next point, but these things do not happen consistently and it doesn't make any sense as to why. Therefore, a lot of time is spent just running from each quick travel checkpoint to the place you need to go to, and it becomes quite tiresome. There's a bit of skill checks to spice things up, but I think the game misses a big opportunity by not making them a more prominent aspect of the design, particularly when it comes to conversations. The dialogue trees aren't very dense, and the average quality of the writing rears its ugly head when it comes to the additional dialogue prompts made available by the charisma or intuition skill checks, or by the companions that follow you. There are lines that are supposed to evoke some really deep persuasion techniques that look a bit ridiculous in reality, but in all fairness, there are also good examples peppered throughout the quest you can take. And since I mentioned skills already, let's take a deeper dive in. GreedFall uses a fairly straightforward system, with 3 different categories in which you can put your points when you level up. First is the skill tree, which consists of all the combat abilities and buffs. Next are the attributes, which consist of passive buffs that also serve as a way of unlocking the ability to equip certain items. Last but not least is the talent tree, which all non-combat abilities reside in, and have the option to open up avenues of approaching the game. In my personal opinion, the most interesting are the speech talents for the reason I mentioned above. I've put points into lockpicking in my save, but the high level chests are frankly a joke considering how late you can open them during a playthrough, and some of the shortcuts that are made available with vigor and intuition offer nothing interesting in my opinion. Fortunately, the game is quite generous with reset crystals which allow you to respec your character, but I never used them. This is partially because on the normal difficulty, beyond the early and final stages, the game isn't very hard to be quite frank. In retrospect, I should have played on a hard because for long stretches of the game, I didn't feel challenged at all in combat, so you might want to do that if you don't want to end up in my situation. That being said, the combat is actually quite decent and provides plenty of options. I've played as a part-time gunslinger, full-time two-handed sword barbarian, which also abused bombs and traps from time to time when things got tougher, but judging from the size of the combat skill tree, there's many different ways to do combat. I mentioned at the start of the video that GreedFall is a reminder of how things used to be done, so I think this is as good an opportunity to explain this as any other. Well, as maybe you could see from the footage I've used until now, the game is quite old-fashioned. You've got a third-person camera, a limited number of companions you can choose from the entire roster, you've got a pause combat option in which you can activate various spells and abilities, the level sizes are reasonable with quick travel points between each other. If this doesn't convince you that we're talking about something heavily inspired by the old BioWare games, maybe some awkward romance dialogues will ring a bell. Seriously, why does the game ask me so damn much if I'm really sure I want to pursue this romantic relationship consisting of a 20-second cutscene with unconvincing animations? Damn, it really does feel like Knights of the Old Republic all over again. In all seriousness though, this way of designing RPGs is something that I've missed in certain ways, particularly because there's only so many open world games one can digest in a lifetime, so something with smaller self-contained levels will surely appeal to those that feel jaded by the excessive busy work that exists solely to justify the huge size of the levels that some games have nowadays. Sure, it has very repetitive and respawning mob encounters, and some sections exist solely as locations in which singular quest can send you into, never to be visited ever again, but at the very least it doesn't require you hundreds of hours to fully explore. And frankly, judging from the design of the existing quests, if they were to be stretched to fit an open world game, I would have 100% not been able to complete GreedFall due to how tiresome it could become already as was in the form I played it in. This way instead, it took me around 40 hours to fully complete a playthrough, including all side quests, and only felt my time was starting to get wasted in the final 10 at most. But let's not hide around the bush, the design wasn't a result of choice but one of constraint. I mean, let's be real here, the developer consists of a 20-man team, what else did you expect? In all honesty, the scope of the game is pretty ambitious for such a small number of people, and in some respects they managed to pull it off. Even if there's nothing that screams premium quality, GreedFall is a very respectable AA game. Sure, there's jank from time to time, some minor bugs here and there, but I never encountered anything that's even close to infuriating, nevertheless game breaking. The only aspect where the lack of team size and budget is made really obvious is the cut of some really important cutscenes in some side quests. The best example is one where you have to collect evidence to prosecute someone. In one of the dialogues your character is promised presence in the trial, but when the big trial comes up you end up having it happen off screen in a very anticlimactic fashion. It's disappointing, sure, but the game has its fair share of really engaging cutscenes at important moments in the story, so I feel it would be quite unfair to moan too much about this aspect. If this were a bigger studio I'd be less lenient, but in this case I think Spiders should be commended for the quality of their work. That being said, I don't know if I can wholeheartedly recommend it at its base price of $35 unless you're an avid RPG fan. I certainly liked my time spent with it, but I don't know how many people would feel comfortable with the game's limitations at that price. But at $20 and less, I have no problems telling anyone watching this to give it a spin. It's a game that has personality in its own way, and even if it never intends on reinventing the wheel, it brings a very unique world to the table in order to draw you in. It certainly worked for me. That being said, thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel in order to not miss out my future content. And until next time, cheers!